It wasn't the bite that stopped everyone cold. It was the silence after.
The horse, a gray-black mustang the men at Caldwell Creek Ranch had taken to calling Gravedigger, had just thrown the third wrangler in 2 weeks. The man hit the fence post on the way down and didn't get up for a long moment.
When he finally did, spitting dust and blood, he walked straight to the barn door, pulled his hat off the hook, and left without a word. No one blamed him. Gravedigger stood in the center of the corral like he'd been carved from the land itself, chest heaving, nostrils wide, eyes rolling white at the edges.
He wasn't wild the way young horses were wild, loose and confused and curious. He was something else. Something that had been broken and then stitched back together wrong, and now every hand that reached for him felt like the original wound all over again.
Rafe Caldwell watched from the top rail,
jaw tight, arms crossed. He'd paid $400 for that horse at the Tulsa sale. His foreman had told him not to.
3 of his best men had tried and failed.
And now he had a 1,200-pound animal that couldn't be ridden, couldn't be worked, and couldn't be sold to anyone with a clear conscience. He was still standing there, staring at the empty corral, when the wagon from town came up the road. Sylvie Crane had not expected New Mexico territory to be this quiet. She stepped down from the wagon with one trunk, one hat box, and the kind of careful, measured look on her face that a person develops when they've learned not to let their reactions show too early. She was 26 years old. She had come from Missouri on the back of a letter that had taken 3 weeks to reach her and another 3 weeks to answer. A letter from a man she had never met, looking for a woman who could cook, keep house, and wasn't afraid of hard work. She was all 3 of those things. She was also, though the letter had not asked, a woman who had grown up on her father's breeding farm outside of Hannibal, who had spent more hours of her childhood with horses than with people, and who understood, in the quiet particular way that some people understand music or mathematics,
how a frightened animal thought. None of that had been in her letter. She hadn't thought it relevant.
Rafe met her at the wagon with the stiff formality of a man who had been talked into something he wasn't sure he believed in.
He was 41, sunburned, taciturn, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once,
and was now just weathered and tired. He shook her hand. He showed her the house. He told her meals were at 6 and noon and that the men ate first.
All right, Sylvie said. That was all.
She didn't ask about the horse for 3 days. She heard about Gravedigger before she saw him. The ranch hands talked around her the way people talk around new furniture, loud enough that she could hear, quiet enough that they could pretend she couldn't. A man named Dolan told another man named Price that the new woman seemed decent enough, but that Caldwell was a fool for thinking a cook was going to solve the problem of that horse. Price said the horse wasn't a problem.
The horse was a disaster.
And that if Caldwell had any sense, he'd put the animal down before somebody got killed. Sylvie stood at the stove and said nothing. On the 4th morning, before anyone else was up, she took a tin cup of coffee and walked out to the corral fence.
Gravedigger was in the far corner. He turned to look at her the way horses do when something new arrives. Full body pivot, ears locked forward, every muscle coiled and waiting to decide.
She didn't move toward the fence. She sat down on an overturned water bucket 20 feet away and drank her coffee and watched the sky go from black to gray to pale gold and didn't look at him directly. He watched her for 40 minutes without moving. When she finally went back inside to start breakfast, she could feel his eyes on her back the whole way. Rafe noticed on the 2nd morning.
You were out by the corral before dawn, he said. It wasn't a question. I was, Sylvie said. Gravedigger didn't give you trouble? No.
Rafe set his coffee cup down.
You know about that horse? I know he threw 3 men, she said, and that the last one left without his wages.
She put a plate in front of him. I'm not planning to ride him, Mr. Caldwell. I'm just getting acquainted.
Rafe looked at her for a moment,
the way a man looks at something he can't quite categorize. Then he picked up his fork and went back to eating and didn't bring it up again. But the next morning, when she went out at first light, he was standing at the kitchen window watching. She learned his patterns before she learned anything else. Gravedigger moved away from anything that came at him straight on. He didn't respond well to sound, not loud sound, not even normal barn sound, the clang of a bucket or the crack of a gate latch. He'd been hit with a rope at some point, probably more than once.
She could see it in the way he flinched when the wind moved the lead lines hanging on the fence post. She started sitting closer each morning. Not much, 6 inches, maybe a foot. Close enough that the distance changed, but slow enough that he had time to decide it was acceptable.
She brought an apple on the 5th day and set it on the ground 4 feet in front of her bucket and went back to looking at the sky.
He didn't touch the apple that day.
He didn't touch it the next day either. On the 3rd day, she came out and the apple was gone, and there was no other explanation for it. She allowed herself a small, private feeling of satisfaction and went inside to start the biscuits. Dolan was the one who finally said something to her face. He came into the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon looking for coffee and found her at the back window, watching the corral, and something about it put a scowl on him.
He was a man who'd been at Caldwell Creek for 11 years, and he had the particular resentment of someone who believes their seniority should translate to influence it never quite does. "You're wasting your time with that animal," he said, not unkindly but not gently either. "He's ruined."
Whatever happened to him before Caldwell bought him, it's in him now. Some horses just don't come back. Sylvie poured him his coffee without turning around.
"Some don't," she agreed.
"So you're just going to keep sitting out there every morning until I know which kind he is." Dolan made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal and took his coffee and left. She heard him say something to Price outside the door, and she heard Price laugh, and she turned back to the window and watched Gravedigger pace the fence line in long, even strides, and thought about the fact that even pacing had a pattern, and patterns had a reason, and reasons could be understood. Rafe came to her on the 19th day. He came in the evening when the men were in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, and he sat down at the kitchen table with the look of a man who had been deciding whether to have a conversation for some time and had finally given in to it.
"What are you doing with that horse?" he asked. Sylvie sat down across from him. "Right now, nothing. Letting him learn that I'm not a threat. That takes this long. For some it does. Depends on how bad the damage was."
She folded her hands on the table. He was hurt by someone who used force. A lot of it.
"You can see it in the way he moves. He's not unpredictable. He's defensive. There's a difference." Rafe was quiet for a moment. "You learned this from your father?"
"I grew up watching him work horses that other people had given up on."
She paused. "Not all of them came back, but some did. And the ones that did, it was never because somebody stronger finally came along. It was because somebody patient finally came along."
Rafe looked at the table. Something moved across his face that she couldn't read entirely, and then it was gone.
"If you hurt yourself with that animal," he said.
"I need you to understand I can't be responsible." "I understand," Sylvie said. "I'm not saying stop, I know." They sat there for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have said more than they expected to and aren't sure what to do with it. "All right," Rafe said finally, and stood up and went to bed. She touched him for the first time on the 23rd day. She didn't plan it exactly, she'd simply sat close enough for long enough, and he'd come to her, the way animals do when they've finally run the calculation and decided the risk is worth it. He put his nose against the back of her hand, just for a second, then he pulled back and turned away as if it had been an accident. She sat very still and didn't make a sound. 2 days later he let her touch his neck. She spent 30 minutes standing next to him in the corral, one hand resting lightly against his shoulder, not moving, not asking anything.
Gravedigger stood with his head low and his ears sideways. Not relaxed, not frightened, somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere that was, for him, probably as close to peace as he'd been in a long while. Price saw it from the bunkhouse door and went to get Dolan. By the time they came back, she was walking back to the house, and the corral was empty, and neither man said a word to her. But that night she heard something different in the way the bunkhouse went quiet when she walked past. Rafe started coming out to the corral in the mornings. He didn't say anything, the first few times. He'd stand at the far fence and watch, and she'd be in the corral with Gravedigger, moving slowly, keeping everything small and quiet, and Rafe would watch with his coffee going cold in his hand.
She pretended not to notice.
Gravedigger noticed but had learned by now that Rafe Caldwell standing at a fence was not something to be afraid of. On a Tuesday in late October, Rafe climbed the fence and sat on the top rail. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can," Sylvie said, not stopping what she was doing, which was walking in slow circles near the horse. "Why does it bother you? What happened to him?" She stopped, considered.
"It doesn't bother me the way you mean it. It's more."
She glanced at Gravedigger, who was watching her with his ears forward.
"Someone taught him that people meant pain, and he believed it, because why wouldn't he? It was true.
And now he's carrying that around like it's the only truth there is." She started walking again.
"That seems like a shame. That's all." Rafe didn't say anything for a while. "My wife was afraid of horses," he said finally. "She died 4 years ago. I don't know why I'm telling you that."
Sylvie didn't look at him. "I'm sorry. She would have liked watching this," he said.
"What you're doing?"
The wind came across the corral and moved the dust in long, slow curls, and Gravedigger dropped his head and blew out a long breath through his nose, and for a moment the whole ranch was very still. The trouble came from outside. A man named Birch Tolliver rode in on a Wednesday with 2 horses he wanted Caldwell to buy and an opinion about everything he saw. He was the kind of man who filled up a room by talking, who treated silence as a personal affront, who clapped men on the shoulder too hard and looked at women like they were furniture that had said something unexpected. He saw Sylvie in the corral with Gravedigger and stopped in the middle of whatever he'd been saying to Rafe.
That your cook? He said. That's Miss Crane, Rafe said. What's she doing in with that horse? Didn't that animal nearly kill your man last month? She's working with him.
Tolliver laughed.
He had a laugh that was too big for the situation. Rafe, come on. That horse needs a firm hand. You let a woman coddle him, you're going to ruin whatever's left.
He cupped his hands around his mouth.
Hey, miss, you want to step out of there? That's not safe.
Sylvie didn't look at him. Gravedigger's ears swung toward the voice. His neck came up. His whole body changed.
She hears you, Rafe said quietly. I'm serious, you need to. Tolliver. Rafe said his name once, flat and final. She hears you. There was a pause.
Sylvie had gone very still, one hand resting on Gravedigger's neck, her voice a low constant murmur that no one outside the corral could quite make out. Slowly, Gravedigger's neck came down. His breathing steadied. His ears turned back toward her. Tolliver watched this happen and was, for perhaps the first time in recent memory, quiet. He tried, once. That afternoon, when Sylvie was back inside, Tolliver convinced Price to let him into the corral with a rope and a crop, talking the whole time about how horses responded to authority and how the problem with animals like this was that nobody had finished the job. Rafe came out of the barn and saw it happening and started walking. He didn't have to intervene. Gravedigger put Tolliver over the fence in about 30 seconds.
Not viciously. The horse didn't bite, didn't strike.
He simply exploded sideways and up in a way that left no option, and Tolliver hit the dust on the far side of the rails and lay there for a moment collecting himself while Price tried not to laugh and failed. Rafe stood at the fence looking down at Tolliver.
You all right? He asked. Fine, Tolliver said. Not fine. Good.
Rafe held out a hand and pulled him up.
I think you had the horses you wanted to sell me, and I think we're probably done for the day. Tolliver left before supper.
Dolan found her in the kitchen that evening. He stood in the doorway for a moment as if he was still deciding something, and then he came in and sat at the table and put his hat in his lap and said, I owe you an apology. Sylvie looked up from the pot she was stirring. What I said. About the horse. He turned his hat brim in his hands.
I've been working horses my whole life, and I told you he couldn't come back. I shouldn't have said that. You believed it when you said it,
Sylvie said. Doesn't make it right to say, she considered him. Dolan was 60-something,
gray-bearded,
a man who had probably spent his whole life certain about the things he was certain about, and was finding in his later years that certainty had a shorter shelf life than he'd imagined. There was something almost touching about it. He's not all the way back, she said.
He may never be, but he's not where he was.
Dolan nodded slowly.
I can see that. That might be all we get, and that might be enough.
Dolan put his hat back on then and stood up. He paused at the door.
My father used to say you could tell a man's character by how he treated a frightened dog.
He looked at the floor, then at her.
I think it applies to other things.
He went out, and she turned back to the stove, and something in her chest that had been braced for weeks quietly let go. She put a saddle on him for the first time on a Sunday in November. She didn't try to ride him. She just set the saddle across his back and let him feel the weight of it, standing next to him, talking in the low, even voice she'd been using for 6 weeks.
Gravedigger trembled.
His skin shivered in long ripples the way horses do when they're working through something. She kept her hand on his shoulder and kept talking, and slowly the trembling stopped. She took the saddle off. The next Sunday, she left it on for 20 minutes. The Sunday after that, she tightened the cinch. Rafe watched all 3 Sundays from the fence. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. There was something in his face by the 3rd Sunday that was different from the first. Less like a man watching an experiment, and more like a man watching something he'd stopped expecting to see. She rode him for the first time on a December morning with frost on the ground, and her breath coming out in small white clouds. The whole ranch watched. She hadn't told anyone she was going to try it. She'd just gone out in the early gray light and gone through the usual routine, and then when everything was quiet and he was calm and the moment felt right, she put her foot in the stirrup. He stood. She swung up. He stood. For 3 full seconds, the entire world was absolutely still, and then Gravedigger walked, just walked, slow, careful, a little stiff, like a man walking across us for the first time. She let him find his own pace and kept her hands light on the reins and made no demands at all, and he walked to the far fence and turned and walked back, and when they reached the center of the corral, he stopped on his own and put his head down and blew out a long, slow breath. She heard someone on the fence exhale.
She thought it might have been Rafe.
She sat very still for a moment with her hand on the horse's neck, and she let herself feel it, the whole strange long arc of the last 2 months, the early mornings and the cold coffee and the patience and the doubt that came in the nighttime hours when she lay awake, wondering if she was wrong about what she'd seen in him, wondering if Dolan had been right, wondering if some damage really was permanent. It wasn't permanent. It hadn't been. She scratched behind his ear, and Gravedigger turned his head just slightly toward her hand, And that was all. That was everything. Rafe came to find her that evening. She was in the barn, checking his feet, when she heard boots on the wooden floor behind her. She finished what she was doing before she straightened up and turned around. Rafe stood a few feet away with his hat in his hands, which was something she'd never seen him do. He was a man who wore his hat like a second skin, and seeing him hold, it was oddly like seeing him without armor.
I want to ask you something, he said.
And I want you to know before I ask that the answer doesn't change anything about your situation here.
If you want to stay, you stay. That's already decided. Sylvie looked at him. All right. He was quiet for a moment. I wrote that letter because I needed someone to help run this house. I didn't expect. He stopped, started again. I didn't expect someone like you. Like me, she said.
Someone who? He looked at the ground and then back at her, and there was something in his face that she recognized because she had been carrying a version of the same thing for weeks now.
I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound foolish. Say it anyway,
Sylvie said. He looked at her steadily. I'd like to know if you'd be willing to make this more permanent. Not just the house, all of it. The barn was very quiet.
Outside, the last light was going thin and silver along the edge of the hills, and somewhere in the corral she could hear Gravedigger moving, slow, unhurried,
Nothing like the animal she'd first seen pacing that fence in fury.
I'd like to think about it, she said. Rafe nodded once. That's fair. I don't mean no. I didn't think you did.
She turned back to the horse, and after a moment she heard Rafe settle against the stall and stay, not leaving, not pressing, just there in the way he'd learned to be these past weeks, present without demanding, waiting without expectation. And it occurred to her that somewhere between the early mornings and the fence rail conversations and the evenings at the kitchen table, he had learned something from watching her, and she had learned something from being watched. And neither of them had said so in words, but they both knew it.
She gave Gravedigger a new name on Christmas morning. She didn't announce it. She just started calling him by it, quietly in the way she'd said everything to him for these past months.
Steady, that was what she called him. Not for what he was when he came to her, broken and burning, and unable to trust a single thing, but for what he'd become, and what he'd been all along underneath the damage, waiting for someone to see it. The name suited him. Rafe heard her use it while passing the corral on his way to the barn, and he slowed and stopped and listened, and something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was close, and he stood there in the cold Christmas morning light for a long moment before he went on.
Sylvie kept talking to the horse, low and steady and sure, the same way she always had.
The name was the only thing that had changed, and somehow that felt like enough.